The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
My name is Professor Avraham Ben-Zvi, and I'm the head of the MA Executive Program in Negotiations and Decision Making in International Relations, which is under the auspices of the Division of International Relations at the University of Haifa. Well, we are a unique program which focuses on the dynamics, the mechanism of decision making in international strategic and diplomatic issues, which are related to the strategic environment of Israel. So Israel is the focus, but we basically provide insights and experimentations for potential diplomats, decision makers. For example, we engage in simulation games and combine theory and practice, comparative basis. And the vantage point, the perspective is the Middle East. But Israel as a focus of our academic attention. So basically for potential diplomats, this provides kind of a workshop, apprenticeship, for elucidating, understanding the dynamics of international strategic diplomatic processes which unfold in the dynamic Middle East. Well, to be sure, official Israel basically viewed the emergence of the 44th President, Barack Obama, with some concern, if not trepidation. Because he was not part of the traditional narrative of the special relationship which were based on an abundance of goodwill, empathy, sympathy, shared history. He was perceived as an outsider in many respects. And today, 6.5 years later, it appears that actually relations are in process of deterioration, accelerated deterioration, and there is a marked erosion in terms not only of the special relationship, but also in terms of the strategic, political partnership, total disagreement concerning the peace process, and also lack of chemistry. I do not believe that chemistry or lack of chemistry comprise an essential component in an alliance, but still I think they can further aggravate, exacerbate relations already fraught with tension, ambiguity, uncertainty, and suspicion, above all suspicion. The newly elected Prime Minister Netanyahu and Obama are on a collision course on a variety of issues, above all, I guess, a mutual distrust and a mistrust and I think lack of chemistry, but also they see in fundamentally different ways the direction of American diplomacy, probably the march toward the end of the American era, I guess the tendency to disengage from the Middle East, at least partially to disengage, and it's not back to the era of isolationism, to be sure, but it's in terms of relying on hard power, there's a diminution in the sense of American presence, willingness to use force. Obviously, it was evident in the Syrian crisis in late 2012, the reluctance to use even symbolic power against the backdrop of the fact that Syria broke all the rules of the game and in using chemical weaponry and despite in defiance of the American clear-cut pledge to use hard power against the government of Bashar Assad. The US at the last moment was reluctant to do so, and also in the context of Iran, which is probably the major test case of American diplomacy, the fact that the US is still addressing the issue of using force as if it is a viable option, but really it is not a viable option. The fact that it is proceeding very rapidly, very enthusiastically, and I think very indiscriminately toward an agreement, despite its obvious shortcomings and weaknesses, indicates that the option of using power or even threatening in a reliable way to use hard power had gone, vanished into oblivion. Obviously, the Syrian crisis, the Syrian civil war is immensely complex. And obviously, Assad's, or part of Assad's opposition is comprised or includes very radical militant groups, including Daesh, including ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra as well. But I think that Obama, by virtue of its reluctance to use power when it still mattered, I think projected an image of such weakness that it probably lost the optimal minute to intervene, not intervene by virtue of force, but it lost the optimal moment in terms of providing significant support, even heavy support, to the central group of the rebels, which had ties with the West, which was relatively moderate. Today it's a total turmoil. You know, extreme radicals from all over the place gathered in Syria, across the border from Iraq, and of course Hezbollah is calling many of the shots, virtually. But Obama missed the chance to influence the outcome by virtue of remaining on the sidelines, despite the fact that the Saudis and Jordanians implored on him to move forcefully. He was very reluctant. He felt that the danger of that some of the heavy arms would fall into the arms of radical of the Al-Qaeda or ISIS would undermine his efforts. But he lost probably the optimal moment, and now it's free for all. And obviously, I guess the collapse of the notion that you can rebuild from scratch old societies and to shape them in the American spirit, in the American way, to extrapolate notions from Western democracy and to export them to the US in the same way that you export Coca-Cola, and believe that overnight, all of a sudden, new institutions and new forms of Western democracy, free elections, etc. would take place. This was an illusion, and Obama was, I guess, drawn into believing, not in Iraq, but during the Arab Spring, for example, that Egypt would become a true democracy and was carried away by the rhetoric. And the whole notion of nation building, which is so, I guess, so quintessentially typical to American thinking, backfired. Well, first of all, I do not believe that any diplomatic initiative vis-a-vis the Palestinians is forthcoming. On the other hand, Netanyahu has been known to be very cautious. And despite the fact that his government will be predominantly right-wing, without any balancing or without any real moderating factor, I think it would be a government of status quo above all. It would not take risks or adventures, and it would not unilaterally kind of change or disrupt the rules of the game. Netanyahu would not declare that the era of the two-state solution, or the notion of the two-state solution is gone. But it would be, again, I guess, an era of procrastination, of basically a deadlock, and because of the domestic constraints. Although, again, Netanyahu will try desperately to maneuver. He doesn't have a broad margin of maneuverability at all. It will be much of the same. And also the fact that the Palestinians were not forthcoming during the last round in terms of recognizing Israel, in terms of the specific terms of the swap, land swap, territorial swap. So maybe the maximum which you can predict is probably return to some phase of maybe partial unilateral withdrawal, or perhaps an interim agreement which would deal with some of the pertinent questions, but not in the core. Not with the core issues, such as Jerusalem, such as recognition. It would be probably, Netanyahu would try to stabilize the situation, to avoid another intifada, but nothing dramatic, comprehensive of the sort that the Oslo Accords of '93 tried to accomplish. Well, I think with President Bush, we had kind of new terms of reference, the roadmap, which were kind of predicated upon the notion of incremental process, mutual process, reciprocal measures. But first of all, you need to have a strong US to provide the goods, the carrots, the compensations, the incentives, the inducements of the parties. I do not see Obama as a strong president capable of providing the inducement and the incentives. He may provide them in the context of Iran, but not in the context of the Palestinians. I think that he's Secretary of State Kerry's initiative was too ambitious, too sweeping, and I guess he sincerely attempted to reach probably the promised land, to comprehensively tackle all those outstanding issues, but I think it was too sweeping, too outstanding, too far-reaching. Today, probably, new terms of reference entail, I guess, a return to modesty, some kind of partial agreements to the extent that they are possible, in the same way that the Israel and Egypt actually proceeded toward the interim agreement in 75, and then later on to a peace agreement. Obviously, in the case of Sinai or Egypt, it was devoid of any ideological primordial sentiment. It was the land for peace, period. Today it's fraught with emotion, ideology. But President Obama, I think that since the beginning of his tenure, his presidency, the Cairo speech of June 2009, he delineated his order of priorities. And the order of priorities were, and I guess his top priority was to reach out to the Muslim world and to try and work with the moderate Arab Sunni regimes. Israel was perceived not as a wunderkind any longer. It was perceived as one player, one actor, not necessarily. He didn't really, I guess he didn't address Israel in terms of special relationship, but as one partner among many coalitions and other partners and actors. But essentially, he wanted to improve relations. He wanted to set a process of rapprochement with the Arab Sunni world, and Israel was expected to pay a price by virtue of making some sacrifices in the Palestinian zone, in the Palestinian sphere, which were actually perceived, or he hoped that these concessions would reverberate throughout the Arab world and would make it easier for the US to forge a coalition with the Saudis, with Egypt, with Jordan. It didn't work out, and ultimately the Arab Spring, I guess, foiled or torpedoed the whole process. Because despite the fact that, again, the case of making peace with Egypt was somewhat less complex in comparison with the Palestinian predicament, still, it was not merely returning or withdrawing from the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for peace, because for President Sadat of Egypt, it was also essential. He perceived himself as custodian of the Palestinian people. He had to provide something, some accomplishments for the Palestinians. So you need desperately an able, innovative mediator, track two, not necessarily formal diplomat, but who understood both the American mind, both the Israeli mind, the Israeli fears, etc. And Leon Charney played a crucial role as part of the back channel, crucial part of the back channel, particularly combining President Carter on the one hand and Israeli Ezra Weizmann, who was absolutely crucial to the negotiations, on the other. So you need to have not just a middleman, but a mediator who enjoys the trust of both parties and who can build the bridges, because between Begin and Sadat, there was an iron wall of mistrusts and suspicion. National Security Advisor Brzezinski was also kind of cold and suspicious toward Israel and Begin. So someone needed to break the ice, to come up with new ideas, formulas, and unfortunately, I do not see an equivalent to Leon Charney today. It's more formal, it's more structured, and I guess we in our diplomacy program, we focus also on track two, on informal channels, which make the jump or the breakthrough sometimes on the basis of the sensitivity, and also sometimes it's as a liaison, sometimes it's easier to make the concessions to the mediator rather than directly to your adversary. So in 78, the story now has been told, but we all benefited from the wisdom and the insight of Leon Charney. Today, I do not see the same level of or the entrance to the diplomatic scene of an equivalent. Well, I think in American history and tradition, at least after the Second World War, there is kind of a reluctance and feeling of exhaustion which pervades the American system. And usually after 8 years, there is, I guess, the pendulum is shifting in the other direction. And except, Eisenhower was a president for 8 years, Clinton was president for 8 years, but except for only, I would say, Reagan was president for 8 years and was followed by President Bush Sr., who was president for 4 years. We had actually 12 years of the Republican Party in power. This was the only exception. 12 years was the maximum, basically. So it is expected that a shift from the Democratic Party back to the Republican Party is perhaps in the making. But of course it depends on the candidates. Hillary Clinton is a strong candidate, also would have a huge amount of campaign money. On the other hand, as was the case in the campaign in the primaries of 2008, there are pockets of opposition, and there is also some kind of innate weakness in his candidacy. Actually, there is not much, she doesn't represent a particularly new message, it doesn't bring new message to the young, to, I would say, multicultural, multi-ethnic America, and I guess she's very vulnerable too. On the other hand, it all depends on the Republican Party, if they recruit someone like Jeb Bush, for example. Although there is also some reluctance in the US political culture to have a kind of a dynasty. But Clinton is very vulnerable. Her philanthropic activities were not altogether so philanthropic, apparently. So it would be a tough road ahead, but the possibility that we shall see a Republican president come January 20th, 2017 is not high probability, it's a possibility, definitely. Well, the problem is that in the past, Israel enjoyed bipartisan support of two parties. And basically in many initiatives, legislation, activities, bills that Congress introduced or passed that were designed to assist, to provide extra special assistance to Israel, these initiatives were supported by both parties overwhelmingly. The danger for Israel is if and when support for its policies, for basic political strategic policies would be perceived as sectorial, as partisan. In recent years, still, Israel enjoys an overwhelming support in Congress, but there is a defection or an erosion of, I would say, part of the liberal wing within the Democratic Party, which is becoming increasingly critical over a variety of issues. But the danger, strategic danger for Israel is in the collapse or erosion of this kind of safety net. Overwhelming support by everyone, conservative, liberal, in Congress, Republican, Democrat. And the danger exists, and I think that last year even accelerated the process. The fact that, for example, Prime Minister Netanyahu was invited on the eve of the Israeli elections by John Boehner, by actually the Republican boss of the House of Representatives, without consulting or even informing the president, is one indication. So if Israel's support becomes sort of partisan or sectorial, that would diminish the appeal, or I would say the magnitude of the special relationship, which is in the past was broadly based and actually combined many segments of American public opinion, American society, which actually were united in their admiration and support for Israel on a variety of reasons, cultural, historical, and religious, etc.
Hi, I'm Leon Charney, and this is the Leon Charney Report. And we have one of the most prominent political figures of this century with us today. We're honored to have Abba Eban. He's been the Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, the UN Ambassador at the beginning of Israel. No one needs an introduction. Abba Eban is probably one of the best writers of the century and probably one of the best orators. So you got 3 out of 3 for this century, and we're going to a new millennium. It's going to be 50 years. And Israel will celebrate its birth, and you were there at the beginning.
I'm very much aware of that, Leon, because there's a sudden beeline for me. The reason is that I have distinguished myself simply by prolonged survival. And people who go around Israel now and look for somebody who was there, present at the creation, unfortunately not many of them. That's because I began when I was 32 years old and became the ambassador to the United Nations and later to Washington as well, and presented my credentials to President Truman. Now, a man who can say when I presented credentials to President Truman sort of dates himself in history, and dates himself also in the special atmosphere of that period.
32 years old. Dramatic vote in November of '47, a partitioning of Israel, big fights and people helping you get those votes. Did you have time to think what Israel would look like 50 years from now, or you were too busy at that point?
I must confess, Leon, that we weren't looking into the future as far as 50 years. Our real position was how to survive for the next 50 months. And that was not easy. Here we were assailed by international alienation and by Arab aggression. And therefore the horizons were very, very sharply defined indeed. I read the other day that President Clinton has said that Security Council resolutions are never important. Well, with all respect, that is not the case. It was very important for Israel to win a ceasefire in June 1948, because if we didn't win that ceasefire, and if the ceasefire was not kept, we could have been wiped out of West Jerusalem, having already been dismissed from East Jerusalem. And those were the issues. Hunger and thirst and famine assailed us. And therefore our horizons never extended to speculation about what it's going to be like 50 years from then.
Many people don't understand, or maybe don't know because it's late, it's 50 years later. George Marshall was the Secretary of State, right? And he was basically anti the establishment of Israel. Harry Truman basically defied the State Department and recognized Israel. This haberdasher named Harry Jacobson, how important was he to get Weizmann in there to see Truman at that time?
Eddie Jacobson was very important, and Eddie Jacobson was very important for the reason that Truman had got it into his head that he didn't want to see anybody amongst the Zionist leaders except one, except Weizmann. Some of us thought that this was preposterous. After all, Chaim Weizmann, with all respect for his lineage and his unexampled achievements, was not the head of the movement. And I remember Truman said to me when I pointed this out, delicately, one had to be very delicate with Harry S. Truman, I said, with all respect, Chaim Weizmann is no longer the leader. He says, look, when you get elected to be President of the United States, you'll damn well decide whom you see and whom you don't see. And that's what I took.
Did you have meetings with Truman after he was president? Did you ever see him after that?
Oh, yes, but the most important meetings were the attempt to get him to see even Weizmann, who arrived very disgruntled and very irritable from London, where he was pining away in the fog and the rain and the sleet. Had a very bad passage on the SS America, I think. And he said, why have you dragged me all the damn way here? And I pointed out that Truman would not see anybody else. And even to see Weizmann, we had to go through a charade. We had to persuade Truman that Chaim Weizmann, in Jewish history, was the exact equivalent of Andrew Jackson in American history. And this is what Jacobson said to me. And then he asked, what should he do about this extraordinary metaphor? So I said, my opinion as a student of American history is that no two people have ever walked on the surface of the earth with fewer common attributes than Chaim Weizmann and Andrew Jackson. But if that's needed in order to get this meeting, then you should tell President Truman that if anyone were to see Andrew Jackson and Chaim Weizmann together, they would not be able to tell them apart.
When you saw Truman after the presidency, was that very exciting to him, the fact that he helped found Israel? Was it very meaningful to him?
Oh, yes, he was very moved by this fact. We had a meeting in Washington, which was a kind of celebration. He had already decided not to run again. And I made a speech then, and I said that Israel has no orders of chivalry, we have no honors, we don't pin things on our front shirts. Only one thing Israel can confer: immortality. And when I said that, there was Truman sort of weeping into his handkerchief.
Why was Marshall so against, was it oil?
Marshall had the belief, shared, I must tell you, Leon, by nearly all the military experts of the time, that just Israel couldn't make it. We'd get wiped out. And just when we were about to be wiped out, the United States would be forced into the combat. In other words, there was a total skepticism about the capacity of Israel to survive what seemed to be this very impressive Arab assault from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Syria, from everywhere. And Marshall had the fear that the United States would be brought into the conflict in order to help the Israelis abandon the ship and not being thrown into the sea, but to prevent Israel from being thrown into the sea. Marshall, with his skepticism, thought that our only chance was to avoid proclaiming our independence. And I remember that he said to Clark Clifford, who was a decisive figure in those days, he said to Clark Clifford, look, how can, 650,000 Jews withstand X 100 million Arabs? It just can't happen.
How did you get, you were born in Africa, South Africa, or Great Britain?
Yeah. I was born in South Africa. At the age of 7 months, I decided to leave.
That's pretty early.
I had a look at the racial situation there. And then I was brought up in England, and I became a don at Cambridge University.
And you were brought up Zionistic?
Yes, my grandfather used to kidnap me. That's the only word I can use. Every weekend, and the weekend in England is from Friday to Monday morning, and plunge me into Hebrew. He never explained to me what he wanted me to do with that great mass of learning. I know that he was fundamentally and ferociously hostile to the idea of being a rabbi. I think he thought of it rather as the British used to think of Latin and Greek. They were the accoutrements of a gentleman. But at any rate, he filled me with this Hebrew law. The result was that I was bilingual from the age of 5.
Was your grandfather an Orthodox Jew?
He was not even Orthodox in the strict sense. I think his attitude to Judaism was that of a man who admired it for its humanism, for its rationality, for certain rather secular values, but whose devotion to the language of the Bible was an intense, bursting in his bones.
Did you spend some time with Chaim Weizmann before the State of Israel?
Yes, sometime in 1937. I was then lecturing at Cambridge University, which is quite a pleasant occupation. And I get a message from the Zionist headquarters, the effect of which is this. The political secretary, who was then Arthur Lurie, later the ambassador to Britain. No, Arthur Lurie.
Oh, Arthur
Lurie. He was a diplomat.
Right.
He had to go to America for personal reasons, and therefore would I fill in. And therefore, for 5 or 6 months, I worked in the room next to Chaim Weizmann, and was astounded by his extraordinary stature and prestige. It was simply not done, in the British sense, to refuse to see Weizmann. In other words, he had created the illusion that he was the leader already of a very powerful nation on a level of equality with all of the other leaders of nations. I think most of the people who came into contact with him knew that this was not strictly true. But since the British leaders were also people of a romantic bent, there was Lloyd George, who was a Welsh nationalist. There was Balfour, who was basically a Scotsman. And there was Winston Churchill, who was just a maverick, always for whatever other people were against. And they were seized by Weizmann's personality, in addition to which he became very early financially independent because of his contributions in chemical inventions and patents. And therefore, and he was the only man who could produce something called acetone, which was necessary for winning the war. And therefore the British government had made a kind of proclamation: don't annoy Weizmann, at least for the next year and a half. After a year and a half, we'll no longer be dependent on his productions. But for a year and a half, Weizmann was very powerful. This gave him access. It's not true that because of this they offered him the country of Palestine. But it is true that he won the most precious of all accesses. He had access to the seats of power.
Was he a great influence on your going to Israel and becoming a Zionist?
Oh yes, he had a very dramatic influence on me. In order to feed this illusion that he was already the head of a powerful state, he found out how heads of state behave. First of all, they drove around in Rolls Royces, and he was able to do that. Secondly, they had big
He had a Rolls
parties.
Royce
Yes,
at that
of course.
time?
They had parties, and he was in a position, because of his success as a chemist, to indulge all these fantasies. And somehow the British leaders of that day, doing very badly in the war, were captivated by this man and his contagious personality.
I've spoken to Asa Weizmann about it, his nephew, who, as you know, is very close with me. And he said in Russia, I think there were 11 siblings, and all of them had doctorates or something. A very well-educated family, the Weizmanns. And for him to, in a sense, bring you to Israel, it must have been a culture shock for you. I mean, you were teaching at Oxford, all of a sudden to wind up in the desert of Israel, it had to be a culture shock.
Oh, the culture shock was very profound, because when the war ended, like many British officers, I sat on the balcony of the King David and wondered what to do. And I had three options. Harold Lasky, who was then the chairman of the Labour Party, offered me a constituency to run.
Is that right?
Yes, in some place in south of England. Secondly, I could have gone back to Cambridge. It would eventually have risen high up in the academic hierarchy. Thirdly, I was working then for the Foreign Office, and I could, if I wanted, stay there. So here was I, and this had a certain amount of chutzpah. I turned down the Foreign Office, I turned down a constituency, and I turned down a chair in Cambridge, because Weizmann's personality was so powerful that when he said, "You are going to work in the Jewish Agency," you think of a Zionist age of about 28 or something, but that was law. And I followed Weizmann into what I believed was going to be a blind alley, because Chertok, Sharet, and all the other Zionist leaders were in jail for rebellion against Britain, and there seemed to be no future in it. It's what I would call a poetic decision. It was not a prosaic decision, but of course I've never had any reason to regret it.
The first time we met, Ambassador, I came to Israel with Senator Vance Hartke of Indiana. I was his counsel. And we met with Golda Meir, who was sitting over here with Simcha Dinitz. And Vance Hartke had an idea in 1972 that Egypt might be amenable to talking about peace. Golda was very adamant. She stuck her hand down. She says, "We don't need them. We don't want them." She was really tough on it, you know. And Hartke walked out and he said, "You know, there's nothing to talk about with this lady." History shows that Golda Meir at times did not really understand, let's say, world politics very well. Would you agree with that or disagree?
I'm afraid I would agree with that. She was very apprehensive about peace. She knew that peace was desirable, but she also knew the price. And the price in those days seemed to be prohibitive. The price would be giving up the whole of Sinai, together with the oil, together with the airfields, together with everything that Sinai then seemed to represent. Also, she had this characteristic. She did not react favorably to good news. When I came once and I said, you know, Prime Minister, Gromyko at Geneva had said some new things. He said that he at least accepts the Resolution 242, which in comparison with what the Soviet attitude had been was quite a lot of progress. She said, well, what language did he talk? I said, he talked Russian. Do you understand Russian? Well, you must have got the translation wrong. And later when Alon took my job, Alon examined the thing, and it was true that Sadat was making some kind of overtures, not sufficient to justify
it was the
peace.
Speaker of the Assembly of Egypt who had told Hartke that he would be ready to speak. This was 72 before the Yom Kippur War, and she was adamant. I'll never forget that. She just didn't want to hear about any peace overtures. And then we came to visit you, and you were more open, but she was the Prime Minister.
That's right.
All right, we're going to cut for a commercial break. We'll come back with one of the most prominent political figures of this century, Abba Eban. Aubrey Eban sometimes. Asa Weizmann sometimes calls him Aubrey, I know that.
That's
and
right.
We'll be right back. We're back. We're talking with Abba Eban, who was the Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, Minister of Education, Ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador to Washington. He's had every title, probably one of the most important figures in Israeli history, and Israel is going to settle, let's see, it's going to be 50 years old soon. And as he said before, not many people can still talk about the beginning. Ambassador, one of the people I think that's been very underrated in Israeli history was Pinchas Sapir. Do you agree with me on that? Did he form the infrastructure of the economic foundations of Israel?
Sapir was a very creative man. First of all, he had a very intimate knowledge of Israel. He and his colleague, Levi Eshkol, were people whose fingers were dug into the soil of Israel. They knew about every bit of pipeline, about every bunch of trees, everything. And Sapir really created what is now the technological basis of Israeli life. And that's a tremendous achievement, because here is Israel, until very recently, with a 7% annual increase of GNP. The United States has a very hard time going above 2 or 3%. And even now it's gone down to 4%. But here we are exporting our transistors and our scanners and our very elaborate missiles all over the world. And I hear that we now have a GNP which is more or less the same rate as Switzerland and Holland and some of these very developed members of the European Union. And if you look deeply into our history, Sapir was the creative force in that achievement.
All right, let's go back a little bit. Maybe you can illuminate me. Ben-Gurion and Weizmann never got along. Michael Barzoa was on my program last week, and he said Ben-Gurion used to send beautiful letters to Weizmann, but in his heart of hearts, he wanted him to disappear someplace. Was it the fact that he was a refined gentleman and a world statesman, or whatever he was, Weizmann versus Ben-Gurion, who sort of was the street fighter? What was it exactly?
It was plain jealousy, I think.
That's what he said,
which is a very common
And he said Ben-Gurion was
attribute.
short, so he was always jealous.
There's even one statement in which Ben-Gurion spoke of a meeting with the various British dignitaries, and he said one of those people there was even taller than Weizmann. In other words, Weizmann, of course, was this, so he's 6 feet and so, rather the same build, I think, that Asa has now. And Ben-Gurion once arrived in London, and he went straight down to Bond Street, and he started buying things like cufflinks and fancy shirts because he was invited to the Weizmanns that evening, and he didn't want to cut too modest a figure. So that there was this extraordinary relationship between them. On the one hand, they admired each other, and on the other hand, I think they wished that the other one would just go away. And
could Weizmann have been the Prime Minister of Israel?
no, I don't think he could, because Weizmann's arena was really the world arena, the international arena. He was most distinguished in his one-on-one discussions with people like Churchill and Lloyd George and some of the other leaders in Britain. And later, of course, he absolutely vanquished Truman, which was more unexpected because
and most important.
Yeah, because the difference between Truman and Weizmann, in terms of their backgrounds and their cultural baggage, were very different people. But a man who could win over not only Ben-Gurion, but also people like Churchill and like Truman, that was a tremendous asset for the Zionist movement. And I'll say this in respect of Ben-Gurion and Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, although they knew that Weizmann was no longer the leader, they did encourage him, not only allow him, they encouraged him to go to the United Nations and to weave his spells there. I don't know how many politicians today would like to have their predecessor sort of kibitzing in and running things for them. But I must say that Silver and Ben-Gurion understood that Weizmann had a certain gravity, a certain specific weight, and that they could use it.
What was the great Zionistic influence on Weizmann?
Weizmann was born of a family of, I think, 11 children. They were not very poor. They used to run
Jewish
logs going down the river. And he suddenly developed this theory. He looked around the world, and by a process of analysis, he said, Britain is the country that we really should look out for. And he was stuck in Switzerland, which was a rather boring place to be. And he suddenly found that he could be appointed to a rather modest academic position in Manchester, of all places. He then arrived in Manchester, and he persuaded some of the dignitaries in Manchester, people like Simon Marx and like Israel Ziv, that if they would just finance one visit of him to London every week, and that meant £5 sterling, he would create a situation in which Britain, then the most influential country in the world, would adopt the Zionist program. And I think these very hard-headed businessmen thought he was off his mind, a crazy idea, but they did finance his voyages, and that was the result. And by 1917, he had prodigiously and unexpectedly got not only Britain, but the whole of the League of Nations to support the Zionist program.
Explain, I mean, I don't mean to be mundane about it, but Britain was absolutely cruel after the Second World War about you had to have Aliyah Bet and Aliyah Aleph. Why was it? Was it the Foreign Policy Office? Was it oil? What was really steamrolling this?
Well, it was my job to try and find out what British policy was.
That's
and
why
it was a very gloomy result. The British argument was as follows. The Jews, they've got to be for us anyway, because the alternative is Hitler. The Arabs, they do have an option. They could be for Hitler or they could be for us, for the West. Therefore, we must appease the cooperative Jews, and we must play along with the uncooperative Arabs. It was a very hard-headed and extremely cynical decision. And it was based on the idea that was after all correct. The Jews did not have an alternative. Well, they could go with Hitler.
So you wouldn't say it was really a policy, not anti-Semitism?
Yes, it was a policy. Of course, when a policy is against the Jewish people, then it takes on anti-Semitic language sometimes. No, I think it was a straightforward decision, which lingered on even when Churchill came to power. And the decision was that we have to go with the people who have the option of going with the enemy. And the option of going with the enemy is an Arab option. It is simply not a Jewish option.
In '56, when Ben-Gurion engineered with the French and the British to open up the Suez, you had a pretty rough time with the Americans, didn't you, with Dulles and Eisenhower?
Oh yes, Foster Dulles was very, very virulent about it. The trouble with Dulles, it's not that he had enemies, but his friends couldn't stand it. And he was known to be very devious, and he was attached to a very advanced form of Christian fundamentalism. And he kept asking himself questions which mature statesmen don't ask. He didn't keep asking what is the useful thing to do. He kept asking what is the moral thing to do. And that, of course, got him linked up in all kinds of Christian inhibitions, which included a quite considerable ingredient of plain dislike of Jews.
Did he have a great influence on Eisenhower?
Yes, not a decisive influence, because when the war ended, and I tried to make a balance sheet about Eisenhower, and it had a rather surprising sequel. Eisenhower did not join the effort to take Jerusalem away. He did not try to force refugees upon us, and he did not try with any seriousness to curtail our boundaries. So we emerged, as it were, intact, without any reason for gratitude to Ike, but also the major fears of the Zionist leadership had not been carried out.
Wasn't he very moved by the concentration camps when he came in 1945? Didn't that have a great effect on him?
There is a movie, I think I put it on the air, which shows Eisenhower visiting the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And there he is walking amidst all these terrible emaciated corpses, with people just falling down with exhaustion after the terrors of the war, after the tortures to which they had been subjected. And he didn't say a single word, but one could see the emotion on his face. You could see him saying to himself, is it feasible that human beings can do this to other human beings? And I think that's really what, in the long run, inhibited him from following the State Department course, which at that time, unlike now, was an anti-Zionist course.
Pro-Arab.
Yeah.
Did you find that you've known probably every American president since Truman? Am I correct?
Yes.
Did you find any American president anti-Semitic?
No, I wouldn't say that they would allow themselves to be anti-Semitic. After all, we must remember that when the United Nations was seized of the question, 1947, 1948, we celebrated an enormously dramatic transition. Think of us in 1947, the lowest point in Jewish history. Our homeland is being assailed by international and national violence. And nobody considered that Israel ought to be a state. And there was no movement at the United Nations to admit Israel. The Jewish leaders sat humiliatingly in San Francisco on some kind of lofty balcony miles away, looking down at those 50 members who hadn't moved a finger, most of them, to aid the Allies in the war against Nazism. That was 1947. 1949, our flag is aloft, the gates are open, we are recognized by the major powers, we are members of every conceivable international agency. Now, the spectacular nature of that transition owed something, I think, to the Holocaust. There was a kind of eruption of conscience, even in that very cynical and hard-headed General Assembly. There was, for a very brief moment, a capacity for Israel to drink from the waters of this memory. And I believe that was decisive.